The silence in my house was a curated thing. It was not an absence of sound, but a presence. A weighted blanket I had carefully, methodically stitched together over the last 5 years. It was the sound of polished concrete floors, of triple-paned glass insulating me from the world, of books on shelves that were never read aloud. It was the sound of a life under perfect, sterile control. A fortress. And I was its sole, willing prisoner. My routine was the mortar in the walls of this fortress. 6 a.m., wake. 6:15 a.m., black coffee, brewed in a machine that hissed with quiet efficiency. 06:45, treadmill. The rhythmic slap of my feet on the belt, a metronome counting out the minutes of a day identical to the last. Work was a quiet hum of a high-end server in my office, code spooling across 3 monitors in a language far more logical and predictable than any human tongue. I designed systems. I built digital walls and firewalls, structures of pure logic that kept things out. It was a skill I had perfected in my own life, long before I made it my profession. The house was my masterpiece of isolation. Minimalist to the point of being monastic. White walls, gray furniture, black accents. No photographs, no clutter. Nothing that held a memory, nothing that could whisper of a time before the silence. I had systematically purged the past, believing that if I couldn't see it or touch it, it would cease to exist. I had built a containment unit for a life that had threatened to spill over, to become messy, to feel. And for 5 years, it had worked. My heart rate was a steady, predictable thing. My thoughts were ordered. The phantom ache in my chest had subsided to a dull, manageable throb. A piece of old shrapnel the surgeons decide is safer to leave in than to cut out. I was functional. I was stable. I was numb. It was a lie, of course. A beautiful, architectural lie. The first sign of the breach was water. An insidious darkening at the base of the wall in the guest bathroom. A room I only ever entered to clean. I ignored it for a day. A week. I told myself it was a shadow. But the stain grew. A dark, organic shape that felt like a personal affront to the clean geometry of my life. Then came the smell. Damp, earthy. The scent of decay. The scent of something hidden and broken. The wall, my wall, was compromised. The sound that finally broke me was a groan. Not of pain, but of pressure. A deep, protesting creak from behind the plaster, followed by a sudden, violent hiss, and then a torrent. Water, no longer content to seep, poured from the wall, flooding the cool gray tiles, spilling out into the hallway. It was a catastrophic failure, a system breach. My fortress had been compromised from within. I stood there for a long time, watching the water spread. A tide of chaos rising in my pristine world. My first instinct was to contain it myself, to fix it, to restore the order. But this was a physical problem, a mess of copper and solder and pressure I didn't understand. I was a man of logic, of intangible systems. This required a different kind of knowledge. It required a stranger. Calling the emergency plumbing service felt like a confession of failure. It was an admission that I could not control everything, that the world could and would invade. I gave my address to the dispatcher in a clipped, toneless voice. She promised someone would be there within the hour. I spent that hour building my defenses back up. I put on my armor, a clean-pressed gray shirt, dark jeans. My expression became a carefully neutral mask. He would be a professional. I would be a client. There were rules for this kind of interaction. A script. We would adhere to it. The transaction would be clean, efficient, and impersonal. He would fix the pipe, and then he would leave. The silence would be restored. When the doorbell rang, its chime was an alien sound in the house. I opened the door to a man silhouetted against the weak afternoon light. He was broad in the shoulders, filling the frame, wearing a navy blue work shirt with a company logo stitched over the pocket. He carried a heavy-looking toolbox that he set down with a solid, definitive thud on my porch.
Got a call about a major leak? His voice was lower than I expected, with a rough edge to it, like worn denim.
I nodded, stepping back to let him in. My body language precise, creating distance. This way. He stepped inside, and the sterile air of my home was immediately changed. He brought the outside in with him, the scent of rain-soaked air, of cold metal from his tools, and something else underneath. Soap. A simple, clean bar of soap. He looked around, his eyes taking in the stark, empty space of my foyer, the polished concrete, the single, severe piece of art on the wall. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of self-consciousness, as if my carefully constructed emptiness was being judged. "Whoa," he said, a small huff of air. "Clean place." "The bathroom is down the hall," I said, ignoring the comment, my voice a flat line. I was the client, he was the plumber. That was the line. I led him to the disaster. The water had been shut off at the main, but a shallow lake still covered the floor. He surveyed the damage, his expression unreadable. He crouched down, running a hand over the warped baseboard, his focus absolute. He was a professional. This was a problem to be solved. I felt a small flicker of relief. This would be fine. This was manageable. He looked up at me, his face still in shadow. "This is bad. The pipes burst inside the wall. I'm going to have to cut into the drywall to get to it. It's not going to be a quick fix." "Do what you need to do," I said. He stood up then, and he turned fully towards me, into the light from the hallway fixture, and the world stopped. It was him. It was Noah. Time had been both kind and cruel. The soft, almost boyish lines of his face had hardened into something more defined, more weary. There were fine lines around his eyes I didn't recognize, a faint scar bisecting his left eyebrow. His hair was shorter, and the easy, artistic messiness I remembered had been replaced by something more practical. He was bigger, too. The years had layered muscle onto his frame, born of labor, not of a gym. He looked solid, grounded. He looked like a stranger. But the eyes were the same. A deep, impossible blue that had once been the entire focus of my world. They were the same eyes that had looked at me with adoration, with passion, with a soul-crushing disappointment the last time I had seen them. My heart, that steady, predictable muscle, hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. My breath caught in my throat. The air in the hallway became thick, unbreathable. All the silence I had cultivated, all the walls I had built, they crumbled into dust in a single, silent second. He was looking at me, his head tilted slightly. There was a flicker of something in his expression, confusion, a question mark forming, but no recognition. Of course not. I was different too. Thinner, harder. My hair was shorter. My face was a mask he had never seen. To him, I was just the client. A blank slate. The irony was a blade twisting in my gut. "Okay, Mr. He glanced at the work order on his tablet. "Mr. Hayes." "I'll get started." He called me Mr. Hayes. I could only nod, my throat too tight to form words. I retreated, turning my back on him, walking stiffly to the kitchen. I gripped the edge of the cold marble countertop, my knuckles white. My fortress was not just breached, it was occupied, and the invading force was a ghost. My ghost. The sound started a few minutes later. The scrape of a heavy tarp being laid down. The metallic click and clatter of tools. The sharp, percussive sound of a utility knife scoring drywall. Each noise was an assault, a violation of the sacred quiet. I stood frozen in my kitchen, listening to the sounds of my past tearing a hole in my present. I felt a magnetic pull towards the hallway, an insane desire to stand there and just watch him, to study the stranger he had become, to find traces of the boy I had loved. It was a gravitational force I had to physically fight, bracing myself against the counter, my muscles screaming with the effort of staying still. Stay here. He is a plumber. You are a client. This is a professional transaction. I repeated the words in my head, a mantra against the rising chaos. Hours passed. The sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across my sterile floors. The rhythmic sounds of his work, sawing, the wrenching of metal, muttered curses, became the new soundtrack of the house. I made coffee, my hands shaking so badly I spilled grounds on the counter. The mess felt monumental. I carried a mug to him. It was part of the script. The polite homeowner offering a beverage to the tradesman. It was a normal thing to do. It was safe. He was on his knees, surrounded by a mess of plaster dust, pipes, and tools. His back was to me. His navy shirt was dark with sweat between his shoulder blades. I could see the muscles in his back and arms tense and release as he worked. Coffee, I said. My voice was a croak. He startled, turning around. His face was smudged with dust, and his hair was damp at the temples. He looked tired. He looked up at me, and his blue eyes were unguarded for a second. Oh. Thanks. He took the mug, his calloused, dirty fingers brushing against mine. The contact was electric. A jolt of pure, unadulterated energy that shot up my arm and detonated in my chest. It was 1,000 volts of memory. His skin on mine. It was a feeling I had spent 5 years trying to forget, and it came back with the force of a physical blow. I snatched my hand back as if I'd been burned. He didn't seem to notice. Or if he did, he hid it well. He took a sip of the coffee, his throat working as he swallowed. This is a bigger job than I thought, he said, his voice raspy with dust. The corrosion runs all the way back. I'll have to replace this whole section. I'll be back tomorrow to finish up. Tomorrow. The word hung in the air between us. He was coming back. Another day of him in my house. Another day of this exquisite torture. And then it happened. As he turned back to his work, taking another sip of coffee, he started to hum. It was low, almost subconscious. A thoughtless little tune to fill the silence of his labor. But it wasn't just any tune. It was a melody I knew better than my own heartbeat. A simple, melancholic string of notes he had composed one rainy Tuesday on a cheap, second-hand guitar. He'd written it for me. It was about finding a quiet place in a loud world. It had no lyrics. It never needed them. It was our song, a secret language, and he was humming it. Here, now, in the ruins of my bathroom wall. The sound hit me with the force of a physical impact. The air left my lungs. The carefully constructed armor I wore, the stoicism, the professional distance, it all vaporized. I was 23 again, lying in his bed, listening to him play, the scent of his skin and the rain on the window filling my world. He didn't know. He was just humming a forgotten tune from a life he'd left behind. But I knew. And in that moment, I understood that this wasn't an invasion. It was a haunting. And the ghost wasn't him. It was me. He worked for another hour, the humming a constant, brutal counterpoint to the sounds of demolition. I didn't move from the kitchen. I couldn't. I was paralyzed by the sound, by the proximity of him, by the sheer, crushing weight of what was happening. My fortress had fallen, and I was standing in the rubble, completely exposed. When he finally packed up for the day, the silence he left behind was different. It was no longer the curated, weighted silence of my own making. It was a hollow, ringing void. It was an absence. His absence. The air still held a trace of his scent. Sweat, soap, dust. The house felt impossibly empty without the sound of his work, without his presence. I walked back to the bathroom. The hole in the wall was huge, a gaping wound exposing the guts of the house. Pipes and wires snaked through the darkness. It looked like a desecration. But all I could think about was that he had been there, kneeling on my floor, a part of my life again, however briefly, however anonymously. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the cold floor of my living room, staring at the city lights through the vast expanse of glass. I replayed every second of the day, the way he filled the doorway, the sound of his voice, the brief, searing touch of his hand, and the humming. Always the humming. Did he remember? Did he have any idea who I was? Or was I just a face, a client, a name on a work order? The not knowing was a physical agony. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run to him, grab him by the front of his dusty shirt and shake him. It's me. It's Liam. Don't you remember? But I did nothing. Because I was a coward. I had been a coward 5 years ago, and I was a coward now. I had built these walls for a reason. I was terrified of what was on the other side. I was terrified of him. The next morning, I was a wreck. My hands trembled as I made coffee. I felt raw, stripped of a protective layer of skin. I heard his van pull up at exactly 8 o'clock. Punctual. Professional. Noah was always punctual. It was one of the things I had loved about him. His quiet reliability. The sound of the doorbell was a summons. I opened it, my face set in the same neutral mask as yesterday. "Morning, Mr. Hayes," he said. He looked more rested today. His hair was damp, as if from a recent shower. The clean soap scent was stronger. "Morning," I managed to say. "Coffee?" "Please, the script." We were back to the script. I felt a bizarre wave of relief, followed immediately by a crushing wave of disappointment. He went straight to work. The sounds were different today, more constructive. The hiss of a blowtorch, the clank of new copper pipes being fitted together. I stayed in my office, trying to work, but the code on my screens was just meaningless symbols. My entire consciousness was focused on the man in the other room. My hyper-analytical mind, the one I used to build flawless digital systems, was now running a constant, spiraling analysis of him. I cataloged every sensory input, the precise rhythm of his hammering, the low grunt of effort when he tightened a fitting, the way the light from the hallway caught the dust motes dancing in the air around him. I was drowning in the data of his presence. Around noon, I heard a loud curse from the bathroom, followed by a heavy thud. Silence. A deep, pressurized silence that felt wrong. My heart lurched. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly on the concrete floor.
Noah?
The name was out of my mouth before I could stop it. It wasn't Mr. whatever his last name was now. It was his name. The name I hadn't said aloud in 5 years. It echoed in the quiet house. I walked quickly to the bathroom. He was sitting on the floor, leaning back against the undamaged part of the wall. His face was pale beneath the grime. He was holding his left hand, his knuckles white. A heavy wrench lay on the floor beside him. "What happened?" I asked, my voice tight with a fear that felt disproportionate. "Slipped," he said through gritted teeth. "Wrench. Hit my hand." I knelt in front of him, my professional distance completely forgotten. "Let me see." He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then held out his hand. His fingers were already starting to swell, a dark bruise forming across the knuckles. "It's nothing," he said, trying to pull his hand back. "It's not nothing," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. I held his hand firmly, my fingers wrapping around his wrist. His skin was warm, rough with calluses. The contact was grounding. It felt real in a way nothing had for years. The frantic energy in my chest calmed, focusing into a single point of concern. "Stay here," I commanded, the words stark and unfamiliar on my tongue. I went to the kitchen and came back with a bag of frozen peas and a clean dish towel. I knelt in front of him again, our knees almost touching. The space between us was charged, humming with an unspoken current. I wrapped the towel around the frozen peas and gently placed it on his injured hand. He winced, a sharp intake of breath. "Sorry," I whispered. He didn't say anything. He just watched me, his blue eyes searching my face. And in that moment, under the harsh glare of the bare bulb he'd rigged up for light, surrounded by the chaos of the demolition, our eyes locked. It wasn't a glance. It was a held gaze. A moment of absolute stillness, where the past and present collapsed into a single point. And I saw it. I saw the recognition dawning in his eyes, the confusion giving way to a dawning, stunned disbelief. He was seeing me. Not Mr. Hayes, the client. He was seeing Liam. My name was a ghost on his lips. Unvoiced, but I heard it all the same. Liam. The armor I had worn for 5 years didn't just crack. It shattered. It fell away from me in pieces, leaving me utterly exposed under his gaze. I felt stripped bare, seen in a way I hadn't allowed myself to be seen by anyone. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. He pulled his hand away, the one I wasn't holding. The movement was slow, deliberate. He reached up, and his fingers, smudged with dirt and grease, brushed a strand of hair from my forehead. It was the lightest of touches, a ghost of a caress, but it set my entire nervous system on fire. "Liam," he whispered. His voice was thick with disbelief. "It's really you." The sound of my name in his mouth, after all this time, was the most beautiful and painful thing I had ever heard. All I could do was nod. We stayed like that for a long moment, kneeling on the dusty floor, the world reduced to the few inches of charged air between us. The carefully constructed lie of our professional relationship was gone. We were just us again. Two people with a history too heavy to carry and too precious to let go of. The spell was broken by the hiss of the ice pack. Noah flinched, looking down at his hand as if just remembering it. He pulled away, creating a chasm of space between us. He stood up, his movements stiff. I can't believe it," he said, shaking his head, not looking at me. "After all this time. This is your house." "Yes," I said, my voice barely audible. He paced the small length of the hallway, a caged energy radiating from him. He ran his good hand through his hair. He looked lost. He looked like the boy I remembered, the one who would pace his small apartment when a song wouldn't come out right. "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked, finally stopping and turning to face me. The question was an accusation. "I didn't," I started, but the words failed me. What could I say? Because I'm a coward? Because seeing you again destroyed the fragile peace I built on your absence? Because I was afraid you wouldn't remember me, and even more afraid that you would? "You called me Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice quiet, laced with a hurt that felt fresh, not 5 years old. "You handed me coffee like I was a stranger." "You are a stranger," I said, and the words were cruel even to my own ears. A defense mechanism, a desperate attempt to rebuild the wall he had just torn down. "We're strangers now, Noah." The hurt in his eyes deepened. He looked from my face to the hole in the wall, to the tools scattered on the floor. He looked like a man who had just realized he was in the wrong place. "Right," he said, his voice flat. "The plumber. I should get back to work." He turned his back on me. The conversation was over. He had retreated behind his own wall now. The professional line was back, thicker and higher than before. But this time, it felt different. It wasn't a comfortable lie. It was a gaping wound. The rest of the day passed in a thick, unbearable silence. There was no more humming. The only sounds were the harsh, angry noises of his work. He moved with a furious, contained energy, as if he were fighting the pipes, punishing them. I retreated to my office, but I couldn't focus. The image of his face when he recognized me was burned into my mind. The hurt in his eyes. He was no longer just a ghost. He was a man. A man I had hurt all over again. Late in the afternoon, a storm rolled in. The sky turned a bruised purple-gray, and the wind began to howl around the corners of the house. The first drops of rain hit the large windows in my living room like handfuls of gravel. Within minutes, it was a deluge. I watched the rain, feeling a strange resonance with the storm. The calm, controlled atmosphere of my life had been shattered, and now the world outside mirrored my internal chaos. I heard Noah packing up his tools. The metallic sounds were final, decisive. He was leaving, and this time it felt permanent. The thought of him walking out that door into the storm, of him disappearing from my life again, was a physical pain. A panic, cold and sharp, seized me. I walked out of my office just as he was heading for the door, toolbox in one hand, his jacket slung over his shoulder. He stopped when he saw me, his expression guarded. "The main pipe is replaced," he said, his tone all business. "I just need to patch the drywall and test the pressure. I can come back tomorrow, or they can send someone else if you'd prefer." Someone else. The words were a punch to the gut. He was offering me an out, a way to restore my silence, my empty fortress. It was the thing I thought I wanted, but I didn't. I didn't want it at all. "Don't," I said. The word was quiet, but it seemed to echo in the space between us. "Don't what?" "Don't send someone else." I took a step closer. The air crackled. I could smell the rain on his jacket, the metallic scent of his work on his skin. "Stay. Finish the job." He watched me, his blue eyes narrowed, searching for the truth behind my words. Why? It was a simple question, but it held the weight of 5 years of silence. Why did I build this house? Why did I push him away? Why was I asking him to stay now? "The storm is bad," I said, a pathetic excuse. It's not safe to drive. A dry, humorless laugh escaped him. I've driven in worse, Liam. That's not an answer. He was right. It wasn't. The time for lies and evasions was over. He deserved the truth. I deserved to finally say it. But the truth was a jagged, difficult thing, lodged deep in my throat. He saw the struggle on my face. His expression softened almost imperceptibly. He looked past me, at the sterile, empty house around us. He looked at the stark white walls, the lack of any personal touch. He looked at me, really looked at me, and I felt as though he could see the gaping emptiness inside me that matched the house. He sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of all the years between us. He dropped his toolbox. The thud was a sound of surrender. "Okay," he said. "I'll stay." The relief that washed over me was so profound, it almost buckled my knees. He wasn't leaving. Not yet. I had another chance. The storm raged outside, a wild, elemental fury that made the house feel both smaller and more like a sanctuary. We existed in a strange limbo. The professional pretense was gone, but we hadn't replaced it with anything else. We were two strangers who knew each other's souls. "You're hungry," I stated. It wasn't a question. He looked surprised. "I'm fine." "No, you're not." I saw the exhaustion etched on his face, the slight tremor in his good hand. He'd been working hard for 2 days, fueled by nothing but my bad coffee. The protector instinct I'd felt earlier surged back, stronger this time. I was no longer the client observing the worker. I was Liam, and this was Noah, and he needed to be taken care of. I went into the kitchen and started pulling things from the refrigerator. I cooked. It was something I rarely did for myself. My own meals were usually Spartan, functional things. But my hands remembered the motions. I remembered what he liked. Simple, hearty food. I made pasta, the sauce rich with herbs. The aroma filled the sterile kitchen, making it feel, for the first time, like a real room in a home. He stood in the doorway watching me, a strange look on his face. "You still cook?" he said softly. "Some things you don't forget," I replied, not looking at him. We ate at the large, empty dining table, the storm providing a dramatic soundtrack outside. The silence between us was different now. It wasn't the hostile silence of the afternoon, nor the empty silence of my solitary life. It was a heavy, waiting silence. A silence full of things that needed to be said. He ate like a man who was starving, and I felt a pang of something sharp and painful in my chest. What had his life been like for the last 5 years? The carefree artist I knew wouldn't have hands like his, wouldn't have that deep weariness in his bones. "Why plumbing?" I asked, breaking the silence. He put his fork down, pushing pasta around his plate. "Music doesn't pay the bills," he said, his voice flat. "Not for most people." "You weren't most people," I said. "You were brilliant." He looked up at me, and his eyes were dark with old pain. "The songs stopped coming," he said simply. "After you left. It all just dried up. The well went dry. It's hard to write about light when you're living in the dark." The words were a physical blow. I felt the air leave my lungs. I was the reason. I had broken not just his heart, but his art. The guilt was a suffocating weight. "I needed a trade," he continued, his voice devoid of self-pity, just stating a fact. "Something real, something solid. Fixing things that are broken." It made sense. It felt useful. He looked at his bruised, calloused hands. It's honest work. I saw it then. The unwitting catalyst, the man with the confident facade, was a facade built over the ruins of a dream. My dream for him, too. He was supposed to be on a stage, not under a sink. And it was my fault. Noah, I started. The apology a useless, pathetic thing. Don't. He cut me off. Don't apologize, Liam. It's too late for that. He pushed his plate away, his appetite gone. I need to ask you something. And I need you to tell me the truth. I braced myself. Why? He asked, his voice raw. Why did you do it? You just disappeared. One day you were my entire world, and the next you were gone. No note, no call, just an empty apartment. You vanished. This was it. The final threshold. The moment of truth I had been running from for 5 years. I looked at him, at the man he had become, strong and weathered and broken. I looked around at the empty, perfect prison I had built for myself. The lie I had been living was so much heavier than the truth I had been hiding. I was scared, I whispered. The confession felt small and ugly in the quiet room. Scared of what? He pressed, his gaze relentless. I loved you. I would have done anything for you. I know. My voice broke. I was scared of that, of how much I loved you. It was too much. It felt like I was losing control, like I was dissolving into you. My whole life was just you, and it terrified me. I didn't know who I was without you. I stood up and walked to the window, unable to look at him as I spoke the ugliest truth of all. And I was scared of what you were, an artist, a musician. Your life was all passion and uncertainty and feeling. I'm not built like that. I need structure. I need control. I saw our future, and it looked like a beautiful, terrifying free fall. And I panicked. I finally turned back to him. Tears were tracking clean paths through the dust on his cheeks, so I ran. I finished, my voice hollow. I chose the empty cage over the fall. It was the biggest mistake of my life. The truth was out. It lay between us, stark and brutal. The storm outside seemed to pause, holding its breath. Noah just sat there, absorbing the confession, his face a mask of pain. He stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. He walked towards me, and for a terrifying second, I thought he was going to hit me. I deserved it. I would have let him, but he didn't stop in front of me. He walked past me, towards the front door. Noah, wait, I pleaded, my voice cracking. The storm. I don't care about the storm, he said, his back to me. He grabbed his jacket. Panic, pure and absolute, clawed at my throat. I couldn't lose him again. I couldn't survive him walking out that door a second time. My carefully constructed world had been demolished, and he was the only thing left standing in the rubble. I couldn't go back to the silence. Not now. I made the conscious choice. I abandoned the last of my rules, the last vestiges of my fear. I crossed the final threshold. I moved behind him, and I wrapped my arms around him from behind, pressing my face into the rough fabric of his work shirt. I held on like a drowning man. The muscles in his back were rigid, hard as stone. Please, I begged, the word muffled against his back. Don't go. Please don't leave me again. He stood frozen for a long moment. I could feel the conflict in him, the war between 5 years of hurt and the pull that still existed between us. I felt the tension in his body, a coiled spring of anger and pain. Then, slowly, I felt it release. A shudder ran through him. He dropped his jacket. His hand came up and covered mine where they were clasped over his chest. He squeezed my fingers, a silent answer. He didn't turn around. Not yet. We just stood there, locked together in the foyer of my empty house, the storm raging around us. It was a surrender, a mutual collapse of walls. I wasn't holding him up. We were holding each other together. I breathed in his scent, rain, soap, metal, and the unique, achingly familiar smell that was just him. It was the scent of coming home. The fortress was gone. The cage was open. And for the first time in 5 years, I wasn't falling. I was being held. He finally turned in my arms, his movements slow, deliberate. He looked down at me, his face streaked with tears and grime. He looked beautiful. "You idiot," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You absolute idiot." "I know," I whispered back. He raised his good hand, the one that wasn't bruised and swollen, and cupped my jaw. His thumb stroked my cheek. It was a touch that held 5 years of questions, of anger, of longing. "All this time," he said, his voice breaking. "All this empty time." Then he closed the remaining distance between us. The kiss wasn't soft or gentle. It was a collision. It was desperate and hungry, a release of all the pressure that had been building for years. It was the taste of salt and rain and regret and a desperate, undeniable hope. It wasn't about lust. It was about recognition. It was about finding a piece of your own soul in another person, and finally coming home to it. We broke apart, breathing heavily, our foreheads resting against each other. The silence that followed was a new kind of silence. It wasn't empty. It wasn't tense. It was full. It was a shared space, a quiet understanding. "The pipe is fixed," he murmured against my lips. "Is it?" I asked, my voice shaky. "The one on the wall is," he said, his blue eyes locking with mine. The rest will take more work." He didn't leave. His toolbox sat by the door, a silent promise. We didn't talk much more that night. The words had been said. The truth was out. Now there was only the aftermath. We ended up in the living room, sitting on the floor, leaning against the cold leather sofa. He let me clean and bandage his injured hand properly. I was gentle, my touch lingering on his skin. He watched my every move, his gaze intense, as if he were memorizing me all over again. Later, I found an old acoustic guitar in the back of a closet. One I had bought years ago with the foolish idea of learning. An artifact from a life I had tried to bury. I handed it to him. He took it, his fingers, even with the injury, finding their old places on the fretboard. He tuned it by ear, the sound of the strings filling the sterile room with a warmth it had never known. And then he played. It wasn't the song he had been humming. It was something new. A melody that was hesitant at first, then grew in confidence. It was a song full of sorrow and hard-won strength, of loneliness and a flicker of hope. It was the sound of the last 5 years of his life, and he was sharing it with me. I sat there and listened, and I finally let myself cry. Not for what I had lost, but for what, by some impossible miracle, I had been given a chance to find again. The storm passed. The sun rose the next morning on a world washed clean. Noah was asleep on the sofa, his face peaceful in the early light. His work shirt was draped over a chair, and he looked younger, more vulnerable, without his professional armor. The hole in the bathroom wall was still there, a reminder of the breach. A reminder that sometimes things have to be broken open to be fixed. My house was a mess. My life was a mess. But for the first time in a very long time, it felt like home. He stayed. He finished the job, patching the drywall with a meticulous care that went beyond professional duty. And when it was done, his tools packed, the invoice paid, he didn't leave. We stood at the door, the same place where our world had almost ended, for a second time. "So," he said, his voice quiet. "What now?" It was the question that hung in the air. The future was an unknown territory. We were two different people than we had been 5 years ago, scarred and changed by the paths we had taken. I reached out and took his hand, my fingers lacing through his. His calloused palm felt strong and real in mine. "Now," I said, meeting his gaze, "we begin." My fortress hadn't been a sign of strength. It was a monument to fear. I had thought strength was in the building of walls, in the rigid control, in the curated silence. I was wrong. Strength was this: the terrifying, beautiful vulnerability of holding his hand, of facing an uncertain future, together. It was in the surrender. It was in letting the right person in, even if they had to break down a wall to do it.